So I will give a brief overview of this field. I think the term pops up again and again, probably in your community as well. So I think it might be useful to define the terms very clearly. So I like to do that. And then I will go in a little bit more depth in actual neuromorphic computing, which is a bit less about hardware. It's a bit more about algorithms. And this is where I think the most obvious overlap is, because when we're looking for certain algorithms, we do look for, hardware support, and I can see how photonics and optical computing could be helpful there. And also could kind of show the directions in which the hardware could be developed. And I do want to go beyond matrix multiplication only for the future of, computing. Okay, so neuromorphic computing hardware. Let's start with a very practical, pragmatic definition. You might hear people arguing about what is neuromorphic computing hardware exactly. So I will define it in the following very inclusive way. So it's some parallel computing substrate with a lot of, cores or some computing units that work in parallel. Typically, these hardware will be proud to have memory and processing tightly integrated one way or another. So either, have a digital device and it has a lot of local memory very close to processing, or you have an analog device or a mixed signal device where, memory and computing are one and the same thing. So this is one very important feature of neuromorphic hardware that is probably the key element for its power efficiency. And another important element is clockless, asynchronous, and event-driven processing that puts it in contrast to other computing devices, such as a CPU that always has a clock, and every clock cycle something needs to happen, or a GPU, the input comes in and an image or some input vector comes in, it triggers computation, and then there's an output produced. Neuromorphic hardware typically supports this asynchronous processing, where different processes can run on different parts of this hardware at their own pace. And not much processing might happen for quite a while until some interesting event is detected, and this is when processing is happening and power is consumed. The technology that is used to develop this neuromorphic hardware can vary. And I will go touch a little bit upon some of these technologies. So it can be mixed signal, analog, digital, VLSI technology that can use something known as memristors, memoristive devices. In-memory computing is also often listed under the label neuromorphic. And then you can have more conventional digital computers. You can have more or less conventional processors arranged in an array in such a way that it still can carry the name of neuromorphic computing. And optical computers could also be called neuromorphic. But the term itself, neuromorphic, what does it mean? So it means brain-inspired. So it's computing that is inspired by biological brains and neural systems. And when I say biological brain, I not only mean the human brain, which is of course an amazing device, but also brains of simpler animals. I always like to show these examples of, some hummingbird that has a brain with only 1 million neurons and can already produce amazing behaviors. Or even more extreme, like the brain of a Drosophila fly, this teeny tiny fly that can recognize smells, can distinguish eatable, not eatable things, can follow, the route, can fly around, only has 100,000 neurons. Imagine, really compact, really efficient system. So all this neuromorphic computing is the brain-inspired computing. So I will start with a little historical overview. So historically, the neuromorphic computing, the first neuromorphic computers were mixed signal VLSI ones. And they were following a bottom-up approach. What does it mean? The brain is fascinating. People who are electrical engineers, like the Kava Mead, one of the founders of this field, they, recognize that brain is fascinating. Brain consists of neurons and synapses. Let's try to emulate those in electronics. So, they talk to biologists and they try to understand a little bit better. So what are these neurons in the brain are doing? They appreciate it. Brains are complex cells. They have something called soma, which seems to integrate incoming signals. The incoming signals seem to come in the form of spikes, so discrete pulses. So nothing in between, and then a pulse comes, and this pulse can be communicated from cell to cell, and not the kind of continuous signals. So the soma integrates those signals. If the activation reaches some threshold, the soma produces a spike as well. And in between, there are some exponential decays that are happening, and integration also has some exponential curves, which Carver thought we can model those with electrical circuits. And then in biology, neurons seem to be, in most cases, connected by something called synapses. Synapse is actually a gap between two neurons, and this gap can be filled with some neurotransmitters and charged molecules that transmit electrical signals from one cell to another cell. And in biology, the synapses have an interesting property, namely plasticity. So they change like all the time. They can get bigger and smaller. So the connection between the two neurons can get stronger or weaker based on the activity of the two connected neurons. So a very interesting property that just fascinated the people. And yes, so both these properties can be, in principle, modeled with very simple electrical circuits. Now, you can represent the charge on the membrane of a neuron with a charge on the capacitor, and you can have some mechanism that compares this charge to a threshold, and then if the threshold is reached, something might happen. So people tinkered around a little bit and came up with a scheme that allowed them to implement a pretty sophisticated model of this biological neuron. It would have the behaviors, the exponential integration curves, and then comparing to the threshold spike, then the reset period, the refractory period when the neuron cannot receive new input, and could model a whole range of biological behaviors. Quite fascinating. They could also build a plastic synapse, so they could build this connection between two neurons that also will have the dynamics that depends on activity of the neuron before the synapse and after the synapse in a very similar way to biology. I will not show you all the curves, but just trust me, they mimic the behavior of biological neurons pretty faithfully. And they managed using, VLSI, very large integration technology, managed to put fairly large number of these neurons on a chip. So this is, for instance, the Rolls chip from around 10 years ago with 256 neurons, with all-to-all connectivity, potentially, with half of the connections non-plastic, half of them plastic. You can use this analog device as a computing device. In this field of mixed signal or analog electronics, there's a trend recently to try to replace, some large chunks of these schematics that are, for instance, responsible for connections between two neurons with memristors. So as you might know, memristors are materials that have this nice property that they can have a resistance that can be changed by typically, some electrical pulses, can be changed and then can be retained. So it's a very nice compact model of a synapse. Something happens, you change your resistance, you changed your connectivity strength, let's say, between two neurons, and then it's kept like that in a non-volatile manner somehow. So here's the list of, from one of the review papers, a list of a couple technologies that allow you to achieve this behavior. It's either based on some filaments that can be built, like filaments of atoms that can be built between, the top electrode and the bottom electrode, changing the conductivity of the device. Some systems use some amorphous materials that can be in the crystalline form or amorphous form, and that changes the conductivity. There are some systems based on some spintronics or ferromagnetic materials, where again you can control the conductivity of a material. Leading to very compact devices. As we just heard from Bert, these compact devices can be used in a crossbar array that allows us to do a very efficient matrix multiplication. Or you can also use these devices in those neuromorphic chips that mimic these biological spiking dynamics. So as the ETH colleague just asked about the nonlinearity, so the solution today is that the memristive devices, they don't provide the nonlinearity. The nonlinearity is provided by neurons that can be implemented with the CMOS technology, in analog technology, and which can be interfaced to the memristive technology. So if one would want to have a combination of memristors and spiking neurons with their nonlinearity, one can do that. Typically in this neuromorphic or spiking chip, you wouldn't use it for modeling very deep networks. You would rather have a simple network with only single layer of learning or plastic synapses. The advantage is that this learning can be continual, so you can continue learning. You don't need to have a training fashion where you slowly converge your very deep network to some solution, but you can have continual learning with memristors. Yeah, here's an overview of development of this memristive technology in the last 30 years, overlaid with the development of large-scale neuromorphic systems, and I will mention some of them in a moment. Um, and today in the research, right, so there are these emerging concepts for, computing going beyond CMOS, and this is where photonic come into play as well, to replace those memoristic devices. And this is one of the schematics, but I think Bert has mentioned how the photonic processors can be used to do this matrix multiplication-like operations in an accelerated fashion. Right, so this was the bottom-up approach, the historically, how neuromorphic hardware came into play. Fascination by the brain, trying to build, the elementary computing units from the brain, and then try to scale up a little bit and then see what happens. Now, in digital, we can see what happens a little bit faster, because in digital technology, it is easier to build a computing system that looks somewhat like a brain. So these are some examples. Intel's Loihi chip, the Spinnaker system from the Human Brain Project, large European project. This is a spec system from SynSense. This is a startup, a spin-off from the University of Zurich and ETH that combines event-based neuromorphic camera with computing chip. And this is an interesting plot that I would like to highlight. This is a plot made by Intel at some point. It compares the energy consumption of neuromorphic Loihi chip to a bunch of other technologies. So, some of them are GPU, a CPU, NVIDIA, yeah, so the GPU, or, my video's accelerator. And on the y-axis, it compares the solution time ratio, so how fast the solution was found and how much energy was spent. And it's always compared to the Leahy. So we can see, it's all over the place. This is the parity line. This is where they're equal. And there are some cases where actually on the neuromorphic chip, the workload would run worse than on the conventional GPU. And those are mostly those deep networks that everyone is so excited about these days. But there are some workloads which are in this corner where we get the advantages from this technology in orders of magnitude. So 5 orders of magnitude advantage in terms of energy and 3 orders in terms of time. And most of these workloads, they are some kind of recurrent networks. That can be, some k-nearest neighbor search network. This can be some optimization network. This can be some simultaneous localization and mapping network. So not deep networks. And this is, I guess, the main message from my talk. When we talk about neural networks and neural networks accelerators, it doesn't have to all be about deep networks only. And this is what we learned with these digital chips. So this is now a zoom in on the Loihi chip from Intel. The first version of it features 128 neuromorphic cores, supporting a bunch of neurons and synapses, complex neural network topology. So I can wire up my neurons however I want. They don't have to be arranged in a layered structure, don't have to be convolutional, don't have to be transformers. Can have little circuits in one place of the neuron, some larger circuit in some other place of the neuron. Has on-chip learning, so all the connections, they can change live on this chip, and it's fully asynchronous. Okay, so when I have this chip, and I had it in my hands, right, at Intel, so the question is, how do I program it? And now if you look at the algorithmic frameworks used by people, the deep learning will, of course, dominate the scene. Why? Because it's so easy to use. You have your network trained easily with 5 lines of code. It's abundant data, abundant tools, abundant benchmarks to compare your algorithm. But is the deep learning the only framework? No, it's not. So I'll just quickly swap through other examples. And if you're curious, we can either talk about that or you can just look up yourself. We have optimization problem solvers, which run on these neuromorphic chips very efficiently. We have a bunch of bio-inspired circuits. We have some conventional algorithms that can be translated into a form compatible with neuromorphic chips. And we have particular frameworks like dynamic neural fields or vector symbolic architectures or algebras that can run on them. Okay, so just the flash for the example. Optimization networks, right? So either graph search tasks or, optimization tasks such as combinatorial optimization, Kubo, so quadratic optimization problem solvers that can be imprinted in your neural network graph, and then the relaxation of this neural network finds the solution for you. Similarity search, right, where you do k-nearest neighbor search in this massively parallel fashion, which has been shown to be advantageous in a bunch of applications. including olfactory sensors. Second, bio-inspired circuits. So there's a whole bunch of architectures and neural circuits that we know from neurobiology that solve useful tasks. Whether it's navigation task with place cells and grid cells and SLAM network, visual odometry, whether there's some action control networks or predictive coding architectures or some inverse kinematics networks. There's a whole library of algorithms that we know from biology that work and that are useful for moving things around. So there are people who take those inspiration from biology and develop algorithms and apply them in technical systems, most typically in robotics. So Guido de Kroon has this example with landing very lightweight 2-gram heavy drones and developing a vision-driven landing algorithm for them, inspired by some vision of a bee, based on the divergence in the visual field. There are some navigation algorithms used by a startup. So for real mobile robots used in retail and logistics, based on ant navigation algorithms. The ants, they look at the horizon, it seems, or can orient themselves based on pattern matching of horizon lines. And then there's very famous older work on rat SLAM, simultaneous localization and mapping, inspired by place cells of a rat and the adrenal cortex used in robotics. Almost done. And so on and so forth. So this is an example of a conventional algorithm such as half transform or a PID controller running on a neuromorphic chip and leading to immense savings in latency. And these are the small complex frameworks where maybe I don't go in for now. Just to flash them, that there are other algorithms out there that are massively parallel, that require support for massively parallel hardware, which are not deep learning. And then in my group, so that's what we do. We take different sensors, partially asynchronous, these event-driven sensors. We develop neural architectures which are not deep learning based. We also develop controllers for robots and try to enable new type of robots that can work in dynamic environments close to humans, where speed of perception is very important. Right. Yeah, that's it. That's our little group in Wädenswil by Zurich. I'm happy to connect if any of you got interested. Thank you.